The day someone threatened to bulldoze my house because they didn't like the color of the paint, I remember standing on my front porch thinking something almost absurd. Not this can't be happening, but something quieter, colder. Of course, this is happening. Because if there's one thing I've learned about people, it's that some of them will try to erase history the moment it becomes inconvenient. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The truth is, the first time I saw that house, it felt like stepping into another century. It wasn't sleek or modern. It didn't have giant glass walls or minimalist furniture or any of that magazine stuff. No, this place had turrets, tall windows with stained glass, and a wraparound porch that curved around the entire structure like the house was stretching its arms out to greet the world. It was over 100 years old, and honestly it looked terrible. Paint peeling off in long strips, vines strangling parts of the brick, windows boarded up like the place had given up waiting for someone to care again. Most people drove past it without even slowing down. But when I stepped inside, something changed. Dust floated through the air in long, golden beams of sunlight. The grand staircase stood there in the center of the foyer like a piece of sculpture. Under layers of cheap paint, you could see intricate wood carvings that someone, decades ago, had spent hours shaping by hand. You could feel the past in that place. Every creaking floorboard sounded like a memory. And right there, standing in that empty foyer, I knew something very simple. This house wasn't broken. It was sleeping. The woman selling it was elderly, soft-spoken. Her family had built the house in the early 1900s, and you could see the emotion in her eyes as she walked me through the rooms. At one point, she mentioned something casually, almost like an afterthought. The surrounding land had eventually been developed into a modern housing community. Rows of new homes had appeared around the property over the last decade. But your property is grandfathered in, she said. Their association rules don't apply to this house. I nodded, signed the papers, and didn't think about it again. That turned out to be my second mistake. The first mistake was falling in love with the place so completely, because for the next 2 years, my life revolved around that house. Weekdays, I worked my normal job. Evenings and weekends, I worked on the mansion, sometimes until midnight. I learned how to repair plaster walls by trial and error. I stripped layers of paint from woodwork that had been buried for decades. I refinished hardwood floors one plank at a time. There were days my hands were blistered, my clothes covered in sawdust, and my back aching so badly I could barely stand upright. Friends came by sometimes, looked around at the chaos, and shook their heads. "You're insane," one of them told me. Maybe I was. But slowly something incredible started happening. The house woke up. The faded gray exterior transformed into a warm Victorian cream with dark green trim. The stained glass windows were uncovered and restored, casting red and blue patterns across the walls every afternoon. Even the garden began returning. Old photographs showed roses everywhere, climbing the fence lines and surrounding the porch. So I planted them again. Roses, hydrangeas, old-fashioned climbing vines. Within months, the yard started looking like something out of another era. By the end of the second year, the mansion wasn't just a construction project anymore. It was home. It was the one place in the world where I felt like something I built actually mattered. Then one Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived. White envelope, official-looking logo, Homeowners Association. I almost tossed it straight into the trash. But curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a polite notice informing me that my exterior paint color, vintage cream, was not part of the HOA's approved palette. It also mentioned my mailbox. Apparently, restoring the original cast-iron mailbox from the property records was considered a violation. I laughed out loud. My house had been standing there before their entire development existed. So I wrote back politely. I explained that my property was exempt from HOA authority and attached a copy of my deed showing no such restrictions. Case closed. Or so I thought. A week later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't polite. Now the violations had multiplied. Paint color, mailbox, landscaping, outdoor lighting, the restored iron fence. Attached to the letter was a bill. $500 in fines. I called the number listed on the letterhead. A woman answered with a voice so sharp it sounded like broken glass scraping against concrete. She informed me that my property was under HOA jurisdiction due to a recent county ordinance expanding the development boundaries. When I asked for documentation of this ordinance, she avoided the question. Just comply with the rules, she said. Pay the fines, or the penalties would increase. That was the moment something shifted inside me, because the tone of her voice made one thing very clear. This wasn't about regulations. This was about control. I told her I wouldn't be paying anything. Then I hung up. The letters started arriving faster after that, and the fines grew. 500, 1,000, 5,000. Every unique detail of the house suddenly became a violation. The antique windows, the rose garden, the vintage light fixtures. They wanted everything replaced with modern materials that matched the rest of their neighborhood. Standard vinyl windows, standard shrubs, neutral beige paint. In other words, they wanted to erase everything that made the house special. I hired a lawyer. After reviewing my property records, he confirmed exactly what I suspected. The HOA had absolutely no authority over my home. He sent them a cease and desist letter explaining the legal reality very clearly. For a few weeks, the letter stopped, and I thought the nightmare was over. Then one afternoon, someone knocked on my door. When I opened it, a county sheriff's deputy stood there holding a thick packet of documents. The HOA had placed a lien on my property. According to their records, unpaid fines had now reached $50,000. And the packet he handed me was a foreclosure notice. They were trying to seize my home. Before leaving, the deputy delivered one final message from the HOA president. Pay immediately, or they would request a court order to demolish the non-compliant structure. Demolish. They were threatening to bulldoze a 100-year-old mansion because they didn't like its paint color. For a moment, I felt something close to panic. Every dollar I had invested was tied up in that house. But then the deputy did something unexpected. He lowered his voice slightly. You might want to contact the Historical Society, he said quietly. And maybe the media. That single sentence changed the direction of everything. Because suddenly I realized something important. This wasn't just a private dispute anymore. It was a story. So that night, I started making calls. Reporters, historical preservation groups, community organizations. I sent photographs of the restoration and copies of the HOA letters. The response was immediate. The next afternoon, a local news crew was standing on my front lawn, filming the mansion behind me while I explained the situation. The story aired that evening, and within hours the internet exploded. People were furious. The local historical society released a public statement calling the house a protected cultural property. Online groups shared the story across social media. A page called Save the Mansion appeared and gathered thousands of supporters. The HOA's social media pages filled with angry comments. Suddenly, the organization that had been threatening me nonstop went completely silent. Their lawyers stopped answering calls. Emails stopped. Then a week later, a letter arrived. But this time, it wasn't from the HOA. It was from the county attorney. After reviewing the case, the county determined something astonishing. The ordinance the HOA claimed gave them authority over my property did not exist. They had fabricated it. The lien was immediately removed, and the county launched an investigation into the HOA's practices. A few days later, the HOA president resigned. Apparently, the deeper investigators looked into their operations, the more problems they found. A few weeks after everything settled down, I stood on the porch one evening watching the sun sink behind the garden. The roses were blooming again. The cream-colored walls glowed in the warm light, and the old cast-iron mailbox stood proudly beside the road. I had won, but the victory taught me something I hadn't expected. Powerful systems often survive not because they are legitimate, but because nobody questions them. For years, that HOA had intimidated people simply because homeowners assumed they had no choice. But the moment someone challenged the lie, the entire structure collapsed. That house had survived over a century. Storms, economic crashes, generations of families. And somehow it survived in HOA too. Which makes me wonder something. When authority crosses the line between order and control, where should the boundary really be? Would you have fought back like I did, or would you have given in just to avoid the trouble? I'd really like to hear what you think. And if you've ever faced someone who tried to use power to push you around, share your story.